So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests involved in writing and publishing. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters who make this show possible. Patrons get to listen to episodes of the show early and gain access to a treasure trove of bonus content that I'm regularly adding to, including over 70 bonus episodes, the TV pilot screenplay I wrote with the novel's character, and more. Please check it out at patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. Last time I talked about the outlining of the very first story of the final quarter, the final act of the novel, Inner Sea. And now we are continuing, I suppose, something of the nautical theme, at least in titles, by discussing the second of 5 stories, Love Letter to a Sailor. Though it's not as consistently applied as in the earlier 3 quarters of the book, this quarter of the book, too, involves me riffing off of a classic SNS character. So, the very first one is really nobody because it's about Vo becoming a sword and sorcery protagonist. The second quarter is very much her Fafford and Grey Mouser years. If you don't know who that is, I discussed them in the earlier episodes, but for the sake of it now, I'll just say they are the original sword and sorcery thief duo, and their adventures tended to be much more lighthearted. Then, in the third quarter, that was Vo's Conan years, her Vonan years, very much being, a warlord, an adventurer, that kind of thing. And now, in this last quarter, Vo is regularly a bit melancholic and dealing with big cosmic forces, which pretty much puts her in her Elric era. In short, Elric of Melniboné is Conan the Barbarian popped inside out. But, and this proves the versatility of the sword and sorcery genre, he's still extremely, very much a sword and sorcery protagonist, despite being very civilized, being very intellectual in his head, and being very physically weak. He's quite dependent on a mixture of drugs and the souls that his magical sword feeds into him, basically, when he fights. There's so much more I could say about Elric, and I probably will say a bit more about him as I work through this outline, so I'm just going to leave that all on the shelf. But yeah, Elric is hugely influential in fantasy fiction from his very first publication in 1961 with The Dreaming City, all the way through to today. And I have to say that when I started outlining this novel, I had, kind of an Elric quarter of the book in mind. I never would have predicted that I would get the opportunity to publish what remains, as of this recording, the latest new Elric story by Michael Moorcock, who is still very much alive and kicking, and if I understand correctly, has plans for some new Elric stories next year in 2025. God bless him. While I have loosely riffed off of some other sword and sorcery stories earlier in this book, like mainly the novella-length one from the Vo's Conan years segment, which is called simply My People for now, a reference to the people of the Black Circle, Love Letter to a Sailor is very much the most direct, like, hey, I love a specific SNS tale, and I'm going to see what it's like to send my character through a very similar story that is nonetheless very different for how it's being written by me, not Michael Moorcock, and for how it stars my character, Vo, and deals with themes and what have yous that, as I'll explain as I work through this outline, to me feel like logical sort of updates, extensions, buildings on, whatever, to what Michael Moorcock did in the most excellent story, The Sailor on the Seas of Fate. Well, that's the name of the slim novella-length collection of 3 novelettes. To be more specific, this story is a riff-off of my favorite of the 3 tales within that book, Sailing to the Future. Don't worry, you don't have to have read it to understand or get anything out of what I'm going to say next. It doesn't hurt if you've read it. I highly recommend you read it. I love the story. But for the purposes of discussing writing process, don't worry about it. Though before I move on, one thing I will say that's really nice about Elric, unlike some sword and sorcery characters, including some fairly big ones like Fafford and Grey Mouser, it's not hard to get new published collections of the Elric stories. There have been many editions over the years. You'll find quite a bit in secondhand bookstores, but only, I want to say 2 years ago now? 1 year ago? Well, you can look it up. There was a brand new trilogy of hardcovers collecting all of the Elric stories up until that point. You'll find it in the very first of those hardcovers, simply called Elric of Melniboné, and it's the third in terms of like chronological storytelling order of the Elric adventures, and they went with chronological, not publication, for that collection. So yeah, pretty early in Elric's adventures. The basics are this. In Sailing to the Future, which is the first story of that novella, the first novelette within it, Elric is on the run. Life is bad, for reasons that you can find in the earlier stories, which I will not spoil for you. And very swiftly, he finds himself on the edge of a rocky sort of beach, wondering what's going to happen to him next, when there comes through a fog, a mysteriously thick and strange fog, a large sailing ship, like a galleon. And very quickly he realizes, like, things aren't right here. That ship is coming way closer than the depth of the water should allow it to. Next thing he knows, he's being hailed. He comes out and grabs a ladder, crawls up onto the boat, and slowly but surely he is introduced to the people on it, eventually meeting the blind captain who has recruited him for some grand mission. Him and 3 others who will each have sort of minions plucked from the crew. I'll get into more detail as I work through my riff on the story. As we go through his conversations with the various people on the boat, the idea of fate and destiny and free will gets played with at length, and eventually concepts of like the multiverse, which Moorcock is famous for, and I believe this is accurate, having coined in the fictional way. I believe it was a scientific concept before he coined it for his stories, and so you can kind of thank him for all the multiverse madness that we have now. I'll get into more of that later. Yeah, anyway, you get to know these different people, discuss these big themes and ideas, and then they go on their mission, which involves dealing with a cosmic level threat. I'll just say that for now. And by the end of it, when they've survived, but at what cost? There's a lot of like, well, that was insane. Who's going to even remember what happened? I don't know. Will you? Maybe. I hope I don't. Or if I do, I hope I remember it as a dream. It's quite the experience for everybody involved. Logically, I felt the first step in my work on this story was to reread Sailing to the Future and make copious notes on whatever leapt out to me as something that I really liked. I wanted to better understand why this is my favorite Elric story. That took up about 3 pages in my standard size moleskin notebook, volume 2 of the 3 notebooks that have been dedicated to this project so far. I think I'll just read to you from the notebook what I wrote, which is this. So, what did we learn? We love the wacky, over-the-topness of the future tale, but are wary of basically copying Mike. Sidebar, that may sound really overfamiliar. I just worked with a guy on one story, doesn't make me his best friend, I know, but he signs everything as Mike, and if you correspond with him for even a little while, you very quickly start to think of him as such. Okay, back to me speaking in my notebook here on what I learned. So yes, I was worried about copying Mike, and I wrote, what would we add? We're very wary of genre awareness creeping in to any kind of multiverse tale, like maybe the gods are bored by them, though I do rather like a line we wrote a little while ago on page 232 of my notebook. That line reads, "Oh, how appealing the multiverse must be to a creature like you. Infinite people, places, resources. You can be as selfish and awful as you want to because nothing matters, and you are the center of it all." Which was me imagining a line of dialogue between Vo and her patron that she deeply resents. I continued, multiversal nihilism akin to deep time nihilism, where everything is so vast that nothing matters. Vo is trapped in a system she hates, her sort of debt slavery, as it were, with the patron, and seeks desperately to escape, remember? I'd briefly considered Vo having her memory wiped at the end of this adventure, but that would mean it wouldn't contribute to her arc, basically, and I wanted that. So maybe, I thought, we open with her assuring, thanking in advance her patron for what he shall surely do, but then we end on her dawning realization that, oh no, oh God, she would be left with her memories of the adventure. An adventure in which she acted as one might do when they know they won't remember anything, or see anybody involved ever again, or return to where they did what they did. Ah, hell yeah. That feels very Elric to me. Meanwhile, we were very curious to have Vo and another character I invented while doing all this outlining, Lidlosta, go on an adventure together, perhaps accompanied by others. Instead of being aspects of one eternal champion, They would instead be pawns of different patrons who have refused to reveal themselves to their pawns. Each pawn has their own theories about their patron, and a scene where they share them would be gold. Oh yes, another key concept that I think Moorcock invented, but if he didn't, he did a great job with it anyway. The idea of the eternal champion. Someone who exists in one form or another in many different realities, often as very different people, yet are all aspects of the same one glorious champion. Elric is one such aspect of the eternal champion, as are the three others that he encounters on the boat with whom he goes to perform his terrifying mission. Trying to bring things back to character with all these big ideas, it occurred to me that Vo would have a much harder time with the implications of the multiverse than the deep time notions that she faced in the previous story. This is because she is very unhappy with where her choices have taken her, this kind of weird patron debt slavery, and knowing there are infinite versions of her who made better choices and or had better luck is galling. The insignificance of deep time minimizes her shitty situation, numbing her to it if anything, while the insignificance of the multiverse sort of maximizes it. Pondering that, I got to a stray thought about how maybe I could have fun with the holding title, Love Letter to a Sailor, and really make it kind of literal in the sense of maybe the big mission that Vo and three other individuals who are themselves servants of different patrons, maybe their big mission is just to create or protect a rift between one multiverse and another so that a message may be passed between them. And this starts to help me get my head around, well, who are the other three people? Maybe one of them is like a scholar who chooses to stay behind and study the whole thing. I don't know. This gets me thinking, though. Big picture, big picture, big picture. Biggest picture, really. And how, you get that sort of weird nihilism once things get so big. So I'm thinking maybe we've got like a thematic statement here, that limitations create meaning, which is kind of fun, especially because that's very true of creativity. And then I started thinking, well, hang on, maybe we can get a thematic question here, something we can explore from different angles for each of our characters. Maybe like, where is the threshold between knowing enough to protect yourself and being aware of so much you go mad or sort of burst? A thematic question that feels very relevant when we all live in an age of social media, etc., and we get to just firehose ourselves with all the world's ills every day if we so choose and or give in to the addiction of that. So I'm thinking, I could refine the phrasing, but I think this is it. And then, each of the four, one of them being Vo, that are assembled for this mission can be embody different answers to it. And this was it. It kind of unlocked things for me. Right here, right now, for this recording, for you, I'm going to introduce this cast of four primarily through how each of them embodies a different perspective on this thematic question. Our four are, of course, our hero, Vo, of the whole novel. Another character who I've actually invented and written a couple of stories for in the time that I've been working on this novel, Litlosta, who essentially started as a kind of sword and sorcery Bjork, which has a lot of resonance for me, and grew into her own thing. Pretty soon you'll be able to read the story Hunter, which is kind of her origin tale, in New Age Sword and Sorcery, issue number 4. In a nutshell, she's kind of an eccentric, traveling singer, hunter, bard kind of situation. I'll leave it at that for now as far as that goes, but the other two, which were invented from whole cloth for this story, one is kind of a nihilistic scientist whose name is Itagil, which is Legati spelled backwards, and if you recognize what that is, you can guess what I'm riffing off there. The other is sort of a priest scholar, who, for now at least, I'm calling Hamascus. I'm going to have to rename him later, I think, because that is the name of the god of knowledge from the old Steve Jackson fighting fantasy universe, which I grew up on and loved very dearly. So Vo, Litlosta, Itagil, and Hamascus. Whether temporarily or for the rest of their lives, each one of these four is serving some kind of big supernatural patron. We've gotten to know Vo's a bit through her stories. The other three we're going to sort of have inferred and whatnot through this story. So how does each of them relate to the question, what is the threshold between knowing enough to protect yourself and being aware of so much you go mad? Well, Litlosta, who's essentially the artist, I guess, of the group, takes in what inspires or pleases her, then metabolizes it as art she then puts back out into the world. I'm thinking she sort of says, if I didn't, I fear I'd burst. Vo mainly takes in knowledge for survival, and to expand her horizons. She grew up on that stinky prison island and has been keen to meet new cultures, learn new languages, try new food, etc. That's already established in the book up to this point, so this felt like the right way to go with her. If Litlost is the artist of the group, then Vo is the traveler, a traveler who now worries that everything is being all flattened out in her mind, that she's taken in too much, and the commonality of humanity's worst traits across cultures is getting her down. So with our artist and our traveler explorer, I thought to myself, how about a scientist who wants to know it all, and a religious type who processes everything through their faith? But then, that's kind of predictable, so I'm thinking maybe flip it to a close-minded scientist who's like close-minded in the sense of being a specialist, who filters everything through his niche interest, and a priest from a religion whose deity is an ascended scholar-type Jesus figure. So they're all about knowing everything. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, that's a bit more interesting than what we usually get in this kind of story. Now, a fun thing here is that I realize, I'm this deep in the novel with so many stories, I'm starting to see connections coming back to thematic statements or conflicts from earlier Vo tales. You can listen to the full episode if you want to get more context, but an earlier Vo story from the second quarter of the book called Flighting Fancy starts to feel relevant. I'm thinking, certainly Vo might even just say the thematic conflict from that story in the context of this one. That thematic conflict for that story, Flighting Fancy, was, we create and care about meaning. Nothing else does. Certainly not the cosmos, and that's fine. That's not what it does. But then we can maybe build on that here by having one of these four people, one of the other three, I should say, replying, okay, so what does it do? So, okay, we have our four, we have what they loosely embody in relation to the thematic conflict, and it's a thing in the original Elric story that, spoiler, of course, there's going to be spoilers galore in this, that the four characters physically are blended together into one mighty cosmic warrior that fights back against the cosmic threat in that tale. And so I'm thinking, what can I do that might be a little different here? Well, one big difference in my thing is that, you've got these four people who each have their patrons, which I'll get into in a sec, basically bossing them around and making them do things. So what if, a twist on the original story from, in mine could be that instead of a cosmic union that allows them to defeat their assigned foe, they form kind of a labor union that allows them to negotiate a better deal for their labors. No slaying the big horrible thing until they have a guarantee of eventual release from their cosmic servitude. Perhaps each of the four even contribute a specific demand that feels in character for them. Vo, of course, wants freedom, guaranteed, end of contract and debt reduction right now, a path to retirement. Litlost wants time for her art and supplies for it, unique, strange supplies for her art. The specialist scientist Legati, pardon me, Itigil, could be like a one-issue voter type. He gets under those nerves, but they need them. Probably going to be a her, but we'll see how that goes. While the scholar priest could be looking for some kind of medical benefits, perhaps a demand that they, their body be made whole upon leaving service. Perhaps they've been injured along the way, and this bothers them from like a theological perspective. So, okay, great. I feel like I'm getting some nice layers of depth here. Each of the four characters, just within the context of the story, has like a goal that isn't just the main adventure goal. And we've even got like kind of a nice collective thing with the four of them hopefully trying to work together to improve their situation and their long cosmic adventures moving forward. So yeah, that feels pretty fun, especially because I find when you get the big cosmic story with the big glowy stuff in the sky and so on, that you kind of don't care about. You really have to have this character level stuff to make it interesting. Why don't you tend to care about the big glowy stuff in the sky, etc.? Well, for me at least in recent years, it's because I've seen it over and over and over and over again. Obviously, I'm thinking about Marvel movies, but superhero stuff in general, which has been pretty popular for quite a while now. It's not really the niche thing it was when I was growing up. Well, niche-ish, right? But I mean, nobody who lived through those days is going to tell you that Michael Keaton's Batman series and what else was going on superhero movies in the 90s and very early 2000s has anything on what it's been like since Iron Man in 2008. But I digress. So, okay, our four characters in this, they are going to be trying to get a better deal or rebel against or whatever you want to call it from their cosmic bosses. That's their union in this story. Well, what does each of them, broadly speaking, think is their patron? Vo reckons some kind of demon or devil as she was tempted into service during a low moment in the story of the gibbet. The priest scholar, of course, thinks Damascus thinks it's their god. I mean, that just makes sense to me. And the Losta, she's the character I've got long plans for. I hope to be able to play with her more. So I think, I'm going to be adding to her canon with this. This gives me different concerns. So I think I'm going to be mindful about giving myself some deniability. I'll be honest with you about that. I'm thinking maybe she herself dryly kind of evades the question when chatting about it with the other three, saying something like, the muse moved me. This idea of the muse as a literal spirit, perhaps, being responsible for her being shoved around all over the universe. The difficult one for me here was Itigil, the sort of, nihilist scientist, not seeing how it matters, but also figuring it's probably a monotheistic god-type deity. He's failing to recognize the conflict between that idea and the universe being uncaring, or seeing the ego in the idea of nihilism, because, nihilism is kind of, that's a whole philosophical thing with many points of view, but if you read Charles Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, a core concept of it is that we humans are outside of nature and that we serve no purpose, but Vo, being, me essentially in this one respect, sees the ego in setting humanity aside from everything else. And we'll call bullshit and get, an argument with Itigil about this. But yeah, you can see how that point of view would shape Itigil's point of view, all guessing about who her patron probably is. I also thought perhaps they would reckon that the person or entity or whatever that's been manipulating them and sending them around on tasks could be some manifestation of their specialty. What is their specialty, Oliver? You said they're a scientist, but they've got a specialty, and it's how they filter everything through everything, and they're a nihilist. So what's their science here? Well, I'm avoiding that question for now and moving on into structure. So, given that I am very much wanting to do kind of my take off of the first third, the first story in The Sailor on the Sea of Fate, I went back and revisited the structure of that. And real short, it amounts to this. Again, spoilers ahead. It has kind of 5 parts. In the first part, Elric is on the run. Stormbringer, his sword, is his only companion. Soon this big ship arrives and he boards it to get out of the bad situation he's in. Part 2. On the ship, he meets one of the 4, of which he is one, and the more interesting sort of hirelings that are there on the ship as well, and eventually the captain, who first provides hints of all this multiverse stuff. Part 3, he meets the rest of the 4, and they all kind of have this weird fate moment of like, we've met before, kind of, time is weird, what's going on here? And it culminates in the mission briefing of being brought to an island, essentially to deal with 2 weird cosmic entities, Gak and Agak, which are sibling sorcerers causing big problems, long story short. Well, short story short, Part 4, they arrive at, the ruins, which some of them think are the ruins of a long-lost city called Tanalorn that they're trying to find, where peace can be found. Again, huge reams of mythos I'm leaving out here. And they pretty quickly enter a building where they hope to find, Gak and Agak. And then part 5, which is, the back end of the whole thing, they reach the heart of the building, which is a very literal kind of big cosmic heart-looking dealie, and realize, holy crap, we're in a side one of the 2 sorcerers who said they'd be human. They could be big, weird structures. There's this union of the 4, very literal union, that becomes the big, sword fighting cosmic entity thing to fight Agak and Agak, to fight Gak and Agak, say that 5 times fast. The 4 then, kill, but also kind of merge with Gagak, and then briefly attempt to fool the sibling, Agak. Then there's kind of a, big transformation. The universe essentially dies and lives and dies again, and then lives again, and then Agak dies, and, all this kind of big cosmic madness happens. The 1 becomes the 4 again, Elric and the other 3. And then there's this kind of like, holy hell, what just happened? They kind of review the madness and death amongst their hirelings who have seen and dealt with so much so quickly. The 4 then choose to leave or stay with the ship, depending on their motivations. And Elric goes to sleep, hoping to forget. That is the extremely, speedrun version of the story. At this point, I decided a good idea would be to kind of walk myself through the story from top to bottom, but with my characters and my themes and the context of me being the one telling this in our present, as opposed to the year the story was written, which makes a difference about a few things, namely what I've referred to before regarding perspective on the concept of the multiverse. Okay, so we begin. I had considered having a framing device, but decided I just needed it on the back end, so we're just going to lead right into the story with Vo on the run. She's not heard her patron's voice for so long. She's begun to think she's free of them. And, we can maybe have fun inferring an untold, for now, mission whose resolution has led to her being hunted. But she seems to have lost her pursuers. We want to get the thematic conflict in there right up top, so, Vo is somewhere alien to her, making it difficult for Vo to know what information is important, what isn't, what to engage with, or how much to engage. You see, she's been sent to so many places, each one requiring she learn new cultures, new threats, new weather, etc., that she's starting to feel kind of like overwhelmed. The simplicity of where we start our story, a cold, rocky shore, is soothing to her, though. Warhammer in one hand, the other deep in her carrier bag, fondling trinkets from past adventures, she ponders as close to nothing as she possibly can. Then the ship comes through the mist. What is the ship? I'll come back to that later. Could be a giant living thing akin to what Vo's armor is made out of, could be made of luminescent and semi-transparent colors that make Vo think of her dire father. Could be some sci-fi shit, at which point I put in brackets, nah. Could be a magic carpet so large it has a small settlement built on it. Could be carved from a tremendous geode. The parting fog around the ship could be the ship. Anyway, the ship opens its bay doors, or throws down a ladder, essentially, and we're off. Thematically, I dig the vessel being made of something which renders things more indistinct and difficult to see, though. So shadows of a sailing vessel exist within this fog. Yeah, let's make the fog the ship. But a certain amount of faith is required to reach into the fog for what you need. Yes, theme! On to part 2. We address our theme as Vo, lacking much in the way of options, boards the ship by way of a D-Day style mouth, let's say. Like those troop thingies that would come to the beach on D-Day and just they kind of had a mouth that opened up on the front of the ship instead of people climbing out the sides or whatever. Anyway, it could be a boarding plank too, whatever you call that. Look up the proper term. Point is, finds her way to the top deck, challenged by figuring out what she needs to know and what she's just curious about, even in just navigating the boat, and what she might be better off not knowing. Perhaps there are strange items in the hold. She's sort of like, should I pay attention to that? Should I not? Eventually, she gets almost on deck and is helped up by one of the noteworthy henchman warriors, who shall be assigned to Vo later. Because, in the original story, each of the 4, in turn, got assigned 4 warriors. That they were their little squad. So, of the main 4, she is the only one with any real martial leadership prowess. So leadership of the wee army raiding party will fall to her. This guy who meets up with her, a mercenary, let's say, should be of her world. And so Vo gets very excited when this makes her think she's home, but he confirms that wherever they are, it's somewhere else. Capital S, somewhere capital E, else. The mercenary leads Vo to where hot wine can be had. Sitting in a shadow nearby is Hamaskus, the scholar priest, who was the first to join. They share what they know, which is not much, and who they are, with Vo. Vo asks if she finds it frustrating to be able to know so little, but Hamaskus enthusiastically responds that it is the pursuit of knowledge that she takes the most pleasure in. Looks like I couldn't get a consistent gender situation going on here. Nothing wrong with that. Oh well. I'll just have to decide for when I actually write the manuscript. Then I wrote down a direct quote from the original story at roughly this point in the structure, which is, "What would you say if I offered you the theory that the sea we sail upon spans more than one world?" In my own words, I gotta get that idea across to Vo here from Hamaskus. Now, unlike Elric at this point in his career, Vo finds this very easy to accept, as she has been sent to other worlds as a servant of her patron. "What is her name?" Hamaskus asks. "I don't know," Vo answers, and were it not for some mementos I carry with me, I might begin to doubt these travels had ever happened, as it has been some time since I last heard their voice. Hamaskus replies, "Well, how long have you served them?" Vo has a pained expression, then answers the question. "How many are on the ship?" Hamaskus says, 16 plus the 4. Vo, the 4? Damascus, we are 2 of that number. I swear, Vo says, I've come across a story somewhere about a 4, a ship. Now, do I want to leave that line in as kind of a, acknowledgement, or is that corny? Is that too meta? These are the things you wrestle with when you try and walk the line of homage. And then, maybe Vo finds Damascus's face familiar as well, with no way of saying why, and her mind begins to wobble just a bit. She says, like, I'm beginning to feel overwhelmed. Damascus puts a hand on her Vo's shoulder. Worry not, all knowledge has the potential to be useful. But then Vo snaps and replies, I cannot hold all knowledge. To which one of the 16, sort of hirelings responds, you shall have to hold a little more, just as they sort of enter the scene. The captain wishes to speak with you now. The door to the captain's office, I'm thinking, is not going to be shrouded in mist. It is quite something. The path to it is easier to navigate than most of the ship as well. Vo's guide does not follow her inside into the captain's room. Now, the captain in Sailors, the original story, is seemingly blind, slightly alien, vaguely resembles kind of an elfin species, the Melnibonéans, which Elric is part of, and cryptic. Apart from clothing, he's identical to a steersman that Elric sees earlier in the original story. So, okay, through the lens of our theme, what should our captain be like? At first I'm thinking perhaps they keep puffing from a pair of hookahs, one to remember, one to forget, or, sipping from straw-like pipes out of the ceiling, but the same idea. The briefing on the mission could be a struggle for Vo to get enough details, and the right details. This would also make navigation more fraught, and our captain more frazzled. Do we carry the metaphor and give him essentially Poster's brain? Visually, is he frazzled? Like big bags under his eyes, a 14th century university scholar kind of appearance, maybe. What might they look like? Or, I start thinking perhaps we stick to them being, a captain, an eye patch they keep putting on and taking off, primitive earplugs, wax on the desk that occasionally get jammed in, one or both, cotton balls for plugging and unplugging the nose, all of it maybe stored on a black marble bust on the desk. Continuing this into instruments, we could have charts that have been torn apart and then pasted back together, sextants and other navigational tools clearly smashed and reassembled many times, a whole bunch of half-abandoned meals around the captain's room, desperately trying to perfectly control and manage at all times what goes in and what goes out. Remember the phrase information diet? Anyway, so then I'm thinking perhaps Vo, seeing the curious way the captain functions, skillfully navigating despite these weird fluctuations and behaviors around sensory input, asks if he is of another species or perhaps possessed. And I like the idea of him responding, no, I'm as human as you. I'm a human who has been bent into a particular shape, who has to keep bending before cooling. Maybe we insert some kind of smithing metaphor because Vo would vibe with that, having had a blacksmith mother and done a bit of blacksmithing herself. And then Vo responds, to follow your metaphor, that will cause the metal to snap. The captain responds, well, there are always more humans. Vo says, is that how you assembled this company? Just choosing whatever of your fellow humans you could scoop up? Usually the myths speak of chosen ones. And the captain kind of shoots that down, just no, He explains that there are key roles, and that the wild tide of information's ebb and flows have washed you specifically, onto my deck. To what end? Vo asks. And thus begins the farcical mission briefing where the captain frequently adjusts their input of knowledge and their input of forgetting. By the end, they have managed to convey to Vo that they are leading everyone to a site that has been cosmically fatigued, perhaps my metaphor for multiverse fatigue, so as to become a thin place where soon a great hand shall reach across from another universe either to deliver or receive a message of great importance. I like the idea that after the briefing is over and Vo is kind of hustled out the door there back into the ship at large, that she realizes she hadn't asked a key question. So frustrated did she become with trying to get concise, trustworthy info out of the captain. She has what feels like the broad strokes plus a bunch of trivia, and that will have to be enough. Part 3, Dinner on the Ship with Everybody Else. This is where we introduce Litlosta, the battle bard, and Itigil, the nihilist scientist. Almost certainly, one or two more of the hirelings that Vo will eventually pick for her own personal squad, but I'm not too stressed about their names and details right now. I like the idea that Hamaskus is trying to be a friend and introduces Vo, who needs to name her island that she's from earlier, let's say, in conversation. To which, Itakil, the scientist, nihilist, responds, Vo of Island? I still haven't named it. Vo of that island, Itakil exclaims as Vo enters. And then sort of says, oh, my theories become even more meaningless. Then she turns to Litlosta. See, Litlosta, not even close to my guess of who would show up next. Who were you expecting? Vo asks. Oh, a pale fellow. Doesn't matter. Yeah, alluding to Elric, obviously. Again, I'm considering these little lines. We'll see how many remain in the final draft. In the original story, this is where we learn that time is all over the show, too, as well as place. So maybe Itakil knows of Vo as a historical figure. And at first this intrigues Vo, then, Itakil's like, but you may have made different choices from the Vo I'm aware of. And we segue into sort of the meaninglessness, the nihilism of the multiverse, the nothingness of infinite abundance. And so Itakil is introduced, basically. But then Litlosta, sort of a part-time hedonist, currently running her tongue along the edge of a cantaloupe slice, check the old Bjork video for Venus as a Boy, scoffs at all of this and argues for the moment, for making choices. She couches this in creating art. Someone else says, well, but how do you choose? How do you make, how do your choices matter? Vo could argue the thematic statement of flighting fancy that I mentioned earlier, but then confess doubts in this, in her ability to create meaning due to this patron servitude period of her life. This, of course, would throw fresh gasoline on Litlosta and Itakil's argument. Hamaskus is fascinated and leaning in, despite Vo suspects having heard it all before. Anyway, I'm not actually trying to set up my own multiverse here, so I don't really want to do anything quite like what happens in the original story, where another character, Michael Moorcock's Coram, says to Elric, we fought together before, and is actually referring to something that you can see in another story that Mike wrote. Anyway, I made a few notes about the first hireling that Vo gets to know. Don't need to get into that right now. Eventually, Hamaskus cozies up, happy to be able to share, their theories with Vo about everything, letting me provide one possible explanation for it to the reader. I like it, whatever it is, Vo can reply. The simplicity of becoming all things, Then they rejoin the conversation at the table, and the four begin to bond over hours of spirited chat and disagreement and bonding and so forth. Finally, Litlosta gives a genuine yawn, not a rhetorical one, telling the story of all this back to her patron. Don't forget, that's the sort of POV of these stories in the back end of the book. Litlosta might say something like, I knew the yawn was genuine, for it didn't come in the middle of Itakil making a statement. Anyway, when they retire to their bunks, Vo says to the room, or they're about to retire, it would help to know when the battle actually begins. And then, for reasons I've left out, so this episode isn't 2 hours long, her first hireling, it's significant that he stops chanting something in the background and says, I think it will be soon, breaking his mantra basically before drifting off to sleep. On to part 4 of 5. Vo standing alone on the deck of the ship. I'm thinking, Vo grew up on an island prison, a terribly limited existence she barely escaped. Now she's heading to an island where all of creation might converge. Will she leave it? If so, for where? And what of all this honky-tonk about time and the multiverse? She'd only just gotten her head around other worlds. Growing up, she'd been taught the world was, her god, Galana's garden, a flat expanse. Might it be Galana's hand that would reach through the tear in the multiversal veil? Might it be an alternate Galana? What is the true Galana? What is the true god? Ah! Overwhelmed, Vo turns her attention to more immediate matters. Hamaskus has arrived to let Vo know the captain wants the four to meet them in their cabin. Landfall will be soon, and the captain does not think their enemies will expect them. So now I turn back to the original story. In the original story, it is at this point we get that, their foes, Gak and Agak, Elric and the gang there, their foes, Gak and Agak, are explained to them, how they're outside the usual Elric grand conflict of law and chaos, totally, amoral consumers of cosmic energy. And then, the champion eternal, four incarnations thing, and so on. And an inference, each of them choosing their four hirelings will be easy as each of their fates are tied to your own. So all kinds of big talk about like essentially fate and free will and so on. And also the captain will not lead them, only wait for the survivors to show up. At which point, the four people in Moorcock's original story give us a wonderful bit of discussion between them about why each of them will fight, with Elric himself basically resisting until the end. At this point, I realize, okay, we've got a very core difference between the original story and my riff on it, which is that my big victory for the story is not over the external cosmic force, the Agak and Gak. It's unionizing, essentially, against the 4 or 3, if, one of them is right and they don't have a patrons. Yet, there must be a foe or foes that the 4's patrons want them to combat for the right to send or receive a message from another universe or another multiverse, if that makes any sense. At which point, dialogue starts coming to me as a way of figuring this out. I think, maybe the captain's like, these beings are amoral in a way which your patrons are not. Vo's like, do you have a patron? But the captain just ignores the question and then continues. They are drawn to cosmic events, feeding off of the energies such things unleash. They would consume the message, yours or the other universes, and digest it, understanding nothing. They might doom us all, or at least rob this unprecedented occurrence of its greatest value, communication with another multiverse. Hamaskus, the knowledge priest, is horrified. Vo and Litlosta are intrigued, and Idigil at least feigns indifference. For all I know, they may consume the other multiverse entirely and use the energy to conquer our own. None should have such power, the captain continues. Vo then wonders about the power of her own patron and what its goals may be. Litlosta then asks the captain if they'll lead them. The answer is, of course, no. Vo's like, well, this isn't my fight. And then the captain responds, it is if your patron wills it. I have not heard their voice in some time, Vo responds. Yet you are here, Isigil, the nihilist scientist, spits. Free will is an illusion. Hamaskus rubs her jaw. Patron or not, I am devoted to learning. I have fought to protect schools from barbarous plunder. I will fight to ensure the sending or receiving of this message. I wish to return home to my own pursuits, says Litlosta. And if this struggle shall earn me that, then so be it. This is my struggle. If not this struggle, then another, mutters Itigil, not being entirely forthcoming. Life is a struggle kind of nonsense. Vo says, I have fought alone for so long. To have sisters at my side, even such as Itigil, would be a balm for my spirit. Ah, yes, right. I eventually decided that it's 4 women because we had 4 men in the original story. At this point, Hamaskus asks the captain, what do their foes even look like? Or foe, or singular, or question mark, The captain's not helpful with this, nor how to defeat them. He has too many answers, all incomplete, and our champions choose to go in ignorant, even Hamaskus. Also, my margins here, I'm still trying to figure out, okay, well, what is Idigil's expertise? And I decided it has nothing to do with his pessimism. That's just his philosophy. Sure, Jesus. Anyway, Idigil is the only one, perhaps, who knows how to operate a kind of ultimate nullifier, which we don't know what that means. It's a reference to an old Fantastic Four comic, essentially the MacGuffin that can allow the characters to overcome the big threat. I kind of like that, sort of put everything about the character to the forefront except for their ultimate purpose and the nuts and bolts of what do they do to, facilitate the plot. So it's all this nihilism and what have you. It's just oh, that's just who I am. Anyway, I'm the only one who knows how to operate the cosmic doohickey, which is just, I kind of like that. My being an asshole is incidental. Meeting over, as they return to their cabins, Itigil sighs about being fated. Litlosta writes, them off as being gloomy. Hamaskus merely listens. The hirelings are here and there, sharpening swords, checking shield straps, and so on in the background. And we wrap up this section with Vo choosing her 4 hirelings, a couple of which maybe kind of choose her in a way. 1 or more don't know it, but they possess skills or abilities vital for the upcoming conflict. Perhaps one is a great potential union organizer. Then I got thinking, well, this is maybe an opportunity for the thematic conflict to be expressed through our 4 characters again, this whole thing of choosing the hirelings and so on. So perhaps Hamaskus has analysis paralysis from, too much information, right? And Itigil is refusing to choose, nothing means anything. And then Litlosta goes with anybody who has a musical ability or an aesthetic which suits her, essentially looking only for herself. Like-minded four people gravitate towards Itagil. Lone wolf, joiners, your typical goth, libertarian types, whatever. Vo chooses her four / is chosen, as I described. So the last four, a real hodgepodge, wind up with Damascus by default. And Itagil's kind of like, doesn't really matter who we choose. And Litlosta's like, well, such fatalism doesn't bode well for survival, as it makes for a life not worth defending. Damascus hardly, quietly is just taking notes, taking everything in. To continue my art, Litlosta continues, that is why I will always fight for my life with all that I have. And then Vo perhaps smiles and goes, I fight for comradeship, for purpose. And then begins to question the value of this, as if surely she could find companionship and purpose through a more peaceful path. Part of the big arc I want to have with her moving away from violence as a way of solving everything. Because it's what she knew on the island, us versus them, bonding through bloodshed. Anyway, Litlosta glances at her makeup pots of color that she has on her. We'd best get some beauty sleep. And that brings us to part 5, the big finale. Now, for me and what I'm doing here, this is where the pressure really adds up. I quickly reviewed the events of this section of the original story, no need to do that here. And then I kind of took a step back and was like, well, what do I absolutely need to know for this last leg that I haven't already established? What is the landscape of the island and how is that significant? What form do their ultimate foes take? What are their names? What is my take on traveling through the body of a foe? What quote-unquote immune system struggles justify the presence of each champion's hirelings the way that in the original story each of the hirelings kind of gets their moment to shine that shows why they're with them inside the body of the sorcerer Agag. Or Gag, pardon me, I think it was Gag. And also, do I even want to model essentially my, characters fighting their way uphill to the main event so closely on what Mike did? Here's a biggie. What quality of Vo combines with what event, discovery, to make the turn to denying their patrons, denying essentially the captain of the ship as well? To that, for the second time while outlining this story, I find myself thinking back to an earlier Vo story outline, Disgrace the Stone, where in that one, Vo basically learned the lesson that, heroism is a concept often abused by powerful people to get less powerful people to sacrifice themselves to achieve something for them. And that is kind of what's happening here. One of my checklist questions for the back end of the book here, the last quarter, also came to mind, of course, how does the cosmic horror of it all affect Vo, given that we are dealing with big cosmic stuff, in particular in this story. And it also occurred to me that if we're going to have our 4 champions battling along with their hirelings, well, Vo and Litlosta are both warriors already, so nothing to explain there, but why would a priest dedicated to knowledge or a nihilist scientist be able to swing a sword or mace or whatever? With Damascus the priest, I felt I can get away with merely alluding to how accumulated knowledge is sometimes seen as a threat by those in power and must be defended. With Itagil, the nihilist scientist, I got to somewhere a little more interesting. I kind of was thinking about how, Itagil has been plucked out of, the multiverse or whatever for having a specific piece of knowledge that can be used here, the specific piece of knowledge that has to be present in order to receive or give the communication or open the, big glowy hole in the sky or whatever to allow that communication to go back or forth. So I'm thinking maybe, okay, Itagil learned in isolation how to do the highly technical thing that is vital to the patron/champions collective endeavor, a piece of information that makes her vital, special. And then I'm thinking Vo maybe kind of looks over at one point and realizes after sort of thinking about the whole big picture of it, and says something to the effect of, you must have killed so many others. This is Vo realizing that there's no way Itagil across infinite, universes and multiverses, etc., was the only one to figure out this technology or this concept science, whatever. So she must have pulled a bit of a Highlander and killed as many others who invented the same thing as her as possible. This is why she too can fight. And this is how, in her, nihilist mindset, she chose to make herself special, to make herself matter, to cope with the overabundance of everything in all of everything. So hey, cool, right? And trying to figure out, why can she swing a sword? I end up getting to how, she's decided everything's meaningless, focusing entirely on her multiversal sciences, how she copes with larger specialty reveals, and of course she will not tell you anything of how it works. Which is plenty fine for me narratively because how it works doesn't matter. Even if the story was big enough to fit explaining some kind of magic system, or science magic system, science fantasy magic system, whatever, for Idigil, it just doesn't matter. What's important is that Idigil knows how to do something vital. And what's interesting is how this comes from and informs her character. So, okay, at this point, I'm thinking, all right, I got these questions flooding my head, and I realize I have been spending a while on this outline at this point, and I could easily spend as much time again just on the finale for all these big things colliding with each other and having to really figure out literally every single moment. So I just think, okay, well, let's do one last very quick move over the whole story of possible beats. Beat sheets are basically just like point form lists of like moments that could happen. You really don't want to get into too much detail on them. As long as I know what these beats are when I come back to actually write the manuscript, I can expand them out with details that I'll figure out then using the information I've already gotten so far to inform those decisions. So real quick, I figure, okay, for this last section, the possible beats are, of course, landing, taking in the landscape of the island, unknowingly encountering the enemy, perhaps, the trials of reaching their final destination, reaching their goal / the true enemy, the urge to unite as a single entity, but then fighting it, and Vo realizing that there's an opportunity here to negotiate the deals essentially with their patrons that have got them all locked into servitude. Debating unionizing versus uniting as the 4-in-1 kind of thing, presenting their case to their patrons. A deal is struck. They refuse to fight. The enemy is confused. And then there's like twin pressures. If the patrons don't cut a deal soon, the enemy will win. And if the 4 don't cut a deal soon, they will be killed by the enemies they've been put across from. To one degree or another, the patrons adjust their deals with their servants in a way that pleases them, and thus, unlike the original story, in this the 4 choose to become one. What does becoming one mean? And of course, we still have, Idigil nihilistically, cynically being like, well, how can we even trust their decision making? But, what do they become? Well, they become a tremendous sort of godlike hermaphrodite. They are the portal, perhaps, revealing a message. Or perhaps they send the message. I've got some side notes here considering very sort of like sexual, but not in like a sexy way, like in a reproductive sciences kind of way. Notes on maybe like, vaginal or phallic imagery. We'll see. This is because I had it in my head at this point about how DNA is information and reproduction of life itself is the passing on of information across time and space. Perhaps universes or multiverses have to exchange DNA essentially to help make sure their respective gene pools don't grow stale, which could be a metaphor for exchange of ideas and so on to try and keep, universes from getting stale. I don't know, man. Something's going on there, though, and I feel like I got to chase it. And of course, this also starts making me think, like, well, actually, hang on, should it be 4 women or should Damascus and Idigil be men if we do the, I don't know. Well, I'll think about it. I'll figure it out later, but this feels kind of wild and kind of like something worth chasing, and that's a good thing to write down for future Oliver. I also see a note in my margins here just saying, beware gender essentialism, ! Which, honestly, always a good warning. So essentially, the big fight is not a fight, it's a big fuck. Especially feels fitting, I think, because when I read big cosmic stories that get to this kind of heightened point, Grant Morrison, the comic author, is really coming to mind here. It can feel a little onanistic, as the author's saying, look, man, I read some crazy stuff and I'm having some big ideas and I just want to smash it all together and it's going to mean something, I swear, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it's entertaining to run through your brain like fingers through your hair. The remaining beats are pretty straightforward after this. The 1 becomes the 4 again. They sort of review the madness and death among their hirelings and how each of them is feeling having gone through this utterly berserk experience. Some of them choose to stay, some of them choose to leave with the ship. Vo, wherever she winds up, sleeps and hopes to forget, perhaps even demands of her patron to wipe her memory, worries that they have before, worries that they won't now. On the other hand, maybe she's sort of conflicted, she wants to forget but doesn't want to risk losing the memory of her sort of carrier bag tchotchke, whatever she takes from this to put in the bag to remind her of this incredible communal experience of working with these other, I'll say heroes, but, having reached the end of this simple beat sheet, I'm feeling like, yeah, I know what this story is. There's still details to figure out, but I know what it is. And the final thing I chose to do before moving on was see what my checklist inspired. This is to say my list of questions that I want to run through with every single one of my stories in this final quarter of the book to make sure that I think about certain things and hit certain notes that I really want to hit. So what goes in her carrier bag and what does it signify? Well, whatever it is, it should signify her turning away from her Vonan loner phase and the power she finds in forming a true union with her peers to mutually support each other as unique equals rather than subsuming their identities into one entity, one brand to serve their bosses. The actual object, I'm leaving that open for now. It'll be something nifty that I'll probably figure out as I'm writing the actual prose. How is Vo turning from stasis to continuing process? Well, she's not perfected. She's learning to take lessons from her peers. So what lessons does she take from Litlosta, from Hamaskus, from Itagil? Well, I know what each of those characters are, so I feel confident I'll be able to answer that later. The patron debt tug of war, how does that evolve? Clearly she negotiates better terms. How does Vo's attitude toward killing evolve? At this point, sometimes a chore, when killing fodder, but can also be a bonding experience, maybe? But then so's drinking at the inn, Litlosta might point out. You don't have to kill people to bond with people. How does the big cosmic horror of it all affect Vo? Well, similar to the previous story, the Deep Time story, Inner Sea, except, when she left her island, I figured she wanted to see the world, not all possible worlds. And this brings us back to limitation creates meaning. Vo decides to create meaning by focusing on what matters to her most, others, human connection. It is perhaps the grounding of human connection with the other three that helps her keep her sanity from leaking out her goddamn ears. How does the story re-enchant the world? Maybe it sounds corny, but I figure the power of human connection. I'm sure I'll put my back into it with the multiversal madness too. I shouldn't just shorthand it. Oh, there's a lot of big glowy lights and stars, yeah. How does Vo reclaim agency through nurturance? I'm thinking perhaps nurturance is how she connects with Itagil, whose nihilistic refusal of the labor union is denying them all agency in that moment of tension where we try to make sure we get all four people on board here. Where is the culture shock? I'm thinking Vo's interactions with peoples of other worlds would provide it. I mean, how might Litlosta shock her, or Hamaskus, or Itagil? Simple things like how they eat when they're at the dinner could be a source of this. What is the thematic statement or conflict? Well, we nailed this early on, thank goodness, We kind of have a statement here with limitations create meaning, and we definitely have a question here with where is the threshold between knowing enough to protect yourself and being, aware of so much you basically go mad. Then we have the two sublists, Brian Murphy's list of SNS qualities. They're all there. I mean, inspired by literary history, perhaps instead of real history, but, it's all there. I'm feeling good. Then there's Ursula K. Le Guin's list of things people can, do in scenes that aren't conflict. And I'm thinking, yeah, we've got parting with her new friends, bearing too much knowledge, discovering all kinds of cosmic truths and human potential. Itagil loses what they felt made them matter. Vo changes, and she relates to her three fellows. Finding, I don't know, maybe it's not there. Doesn't have to be. The point of Le Guin's list, as I see it, is to be basically a bunch of writing prompts to try and get your head out of just having characters be fighting and arguing for the whole story. At this point, I just wrote in big letters on the page, okay then. Trying to figure out, do I keep cranking away at this outline and string it all together into a sequence of events and put all the details in? Or do I just trust future Oliver to do it and move on? I literally wrote here, by the way, what will we tell the podcast if we choose the latter? Surely the theme can guide us through the specifics later? Well, I sort of check with myself and go, well, really all that's left here are specifics of the opposition, some specifics of what the message is, if we even need specifics of what that message is getting passed, received, or both at the same time. Itagil's highly specific knowledge, is it how to open the portal, how to communicate? This is not difficult stuff to figure out later when it really matters. So I ended up writing a mini diary thing for myself here where I just wrote, honestly, I can live with this. We have a powerful theme to guide the small opposition. The main opposition can be non-union, quote-unquote, servants of another patron or patron group who are undone by their non-unionness. Whatever the specifics, we know Itagil facilitates things. Perhaps even the non-union people try to sway her into joining. We get like a scam situation potentially. Yes, I'm ready to move on, I wrote. And I feel good about that decision all these months later. This entry is from December 13th, 2023. The first one of me outlining the story was about 3 months and change earlier. That's enough. I mean, obviously this was my spare time. I didn't literally spend, full-time weeks outlining the story for 3 months. But at a certain point, you always got to just say to yourself, this is enough. I've got the core stuff here. I trust future self to take care of the manuscript using what's here. Let's move on. Let's enjoy some different ideas, different what have you. And I was very excited for the next story I outlined because that was where I wanted to play with a niche subgenre called Sword and Planet. So I'm Writing a Novel features original intro and outro music by Gloria Guns, and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, or checking out any of the other ways you can support the show by heading to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has things like links to our Patreon, Coffee, and PayPal. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll see you soon. Or maybe they send a message. Either way, is there some sort of, very sexually charged, like Vagina. Oh no, Dragon Ball Z's greatest enemy was Vagina.